Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 114 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending August 2nd, 2018, the Zero Tolerance Edition. First, a word about our sponsors, Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 700 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance programs, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. This week, Jay Rosen is out on a well-deserved vacation, so I'm going to take this episode solo. With the Major League Baseball July 31 trade deadline having come and gone, what does zero tolerance mean for the Astros? Some of the topics I'm going to take up are the Astros trade for Jose Oseuna from Toronto. He is under a suspension for domestic abuse, and the Astros have a zero tolerance policy for domestic abusers. How did that happen? Take a look at Mike Volkov's three-part series on deterrence and white-collar crime sentencing. We take a look at whether corporations should take on more responsibility for the global fight against bribery and corruption. We have yet another FCPA arrest in the PDVSA corruption case. We consider the future of Mexico's anti-corruption system. What are some of the teachable moments from the Panasonic FCPA enforcement action? Well, what is the complexity of compliance regulations? There's a new index out for this. I consider companies doing business in Malaysia and what they need to do in light of the current investigations ongoing, particularly around 1MDB, but in a much broader context. And I announce an exciting new 5-part podcast series that will go up next week on innovation and compliance. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. We had some interesting developments in the FCPA compliance and ethics world that I'd like to highlight for you this week. So let's just jump right into it. First of all, Mike Volkov had a very interesting 3-part series on white-collar crime sentencing, and deterrence. In part 1 of his series, he looked at white-collar crime and corporate misconduct and really focused on Judge Jed Radoff, who has been outspoken that the most effective way to deter white-collar crime is to impose stiff sentences on individual actors. Judge Rakoff has railed against the deferred prosecution agreements and no prosecutions of individuals. In part 2, he took a look at white-collar criminals and actually sending them a message. And here he focused on Bernie Madoff and whether or not the message of his 150-year sentence, meaning that he would die in prison, was something that actually got through to white-collar criminals. And an interesting question is whether stiff corporate punishments actually would deter misconduct as well. In part 3, he sort of put it all together by talking about the types of deterrence, both specific and general. And the federal sentencing guidelines are supposed to consider both deterrence and retribution. He notes that most white-collar criminals are typically older, typically have been businessmen for some time, and so they have the opportunity to be contrite and get a reduced sentence. It's a fascinating 3-part exploration of an issue that I think has bedeviled really everyone in the criminal justice system, from prosecutors to judges to defense lawyers to commentators such as myself and Mike. I would certainly urge you to check out his 3-post series. In the FCPA blog, we had a very interesting piece by Dr. Mark Pyman. Dr. Pyman is a fellow at the London Institute, senior fellow that is, for the London Institute for Statecraft. And in this piece, he says that we need greater business leadership in the anti-corruption fight to move from simply admiring the problem of corruption to examining and implementing pieces that contribute to solution. He says businesses need to be an active part of advancing these new agendas, not only at the micro level of good ethics and compliance, but also in the macro level in sector by sector. It's a very interesting perspective, certainly something I've been talking about in terms of that, of compliance being a business response to a legal problem, specifically the FCPA, but Dr. Pyman takes it or Mark Pyman takes it rather in a much broader context. So it's something that I think bears watching going forward, and I'm certainly an advocate of a business response to the scourge of bribery and corruption across the globe. In the corruption case, or perhaps the most corrupt entity that certainly keeps on giving, we have another indictment in the PDVSA bribery case. This time we have an FCPA arrest of a dual U.S. Venezuelan citizen who was in the United States. Jose Manuel Gonzalez Testino was arrested, charged with conspiracy to violate the FCPA. He's alleged to have paid over $600,000 in bribes to former PDVSA officials. He is the 17th defendant charged in this case, and once again, it's simply the case that keeps on giving. You have to wonder why these people are in the United States. Nevertheless, they've subjected themselves to U.S. jurisdiction, and now they are paying the penalty for violating or alleged to have violated the FCPA. In another article found in the FCPA blog this week, this time by Eric Lochner, the president and CEO of Steel Compliance Solutions, took a look at the Panasonic Avionics FCPA enforcement action from April and found several lessons to be learned that every compliance practitioner should consider. First, that due diligence matters all the time, all the way up and down the line. And clearly this is something that should be learned from the Panasonic case. Second, controls matter. Panasonic engaged in considerable books and records violation to try to hide the bribery and corruption that was going on. So having effective financial controls both at the subsidiary and parent level would have helped. Third, and perhaps most importantly, leadership matters if a company wants the first two issues to matter. If you'll recall, we had C-suite involvement in the subsidiary level. It's unclear what the leadership at the parent company in Japan thought about all this, other than the fact that Panasonic Avionics always seemed to make money. So lots of lessons learned. This case, I think, will be studied from the FCPA perspective quite a while going forward because, frankly, there's a lot to unpack in this case. And kudos to Eric Lochner for putting a blog post together laying it out for us. Next up is an article by Robert Clark. Robert is the manager of legal research at Trace International, and he has a guest post up in the FCPA America's blog entitled AMLO's Election and the Future of Mexico's Anti-Corruption System. AMLO, of course, is the new president of Mexico, and it's Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. And Mr. Clark looks at the current Mexico anti-corruption initiatives around the national anti-corruption system and whether that tool can be improved upon and how the new president, who has come into office as a reformer yet is open to reconciliation with his political opponents, will move forward to try and fight bribery and corruption in Mexico. It's a fascinating exploration for every U.S. company involved. I think this is something that you'll need to watch closely and carefully because certainly there have been numerous FCPA actions involving Mexico and that could continue to go forward. Also, if you'll recall, the largest energy company in Mexico, Pemex, has required that companies doing business with it have a compliance program in place. So if you're doing business with Pemex, you need to be in compliance. Next up, we have an article by Jacqueline Jaeger at Compliance Week on a new index, which I think is very interesting, the Compliance Complexity Index. This was created by a company called TMF Group, a multinational professional services organization that specializes in corporate expansions. It's designed to help Legal, risk management, and compliance professionals better understand some of the compliance challenges they expect to encounter in various countries across the globe. Some of the factors from a global perspective include the laws you have to do, such as FACTA, registration of beneficial ownership, other information that you may be required to report to federal regulatory authorities or governmental entities. It is a report that's available for download. We link to it in the show notes. It's a really interesting report, and I think that you'll find it helpful on determining not only the jurisdictions and how their rankings are, but global changes, financial transparency, and where, in fact, the most complex jurisdiction is, as of all countries, the UAE. So take a look at the article by Jacqueline, and she links to the Compliance Complexity Index in her article. Next up, an article that caught my eye is from John Bray and Harrison Ching, writing in the FCPA blog. It's entitled "A Strategic Approach to Compliance in Today's Malaysia." I think it's really important that compliance practitioners understand that risks change, risks mitigate, but risks could also increase. And they start by noting that political developments in Malaysia really should provide a governance wake-up call for international companies operating in the country. Certainly the 1MDB scandal is on everyone's minds, and there have been multiple deals that were in place were canceled due to lack of transparency in the tender process or for other reasons. So first of all, you need to take a look at any deals that you have pending or may have in place, and you need to scrub those deals as thoroughly as you can to make sure that you've done nothing askance. So did you have any third-party partners? Did they go through the appropriate vetting process? Was there any gifts, travel, and entertainment spend? Do an analysis of that. Take a look at the contract price. See if there were any discounts. Did that follow your standard contract risk management process? And were they properly vetted by the commercial side of senior management? But the authors really say that you need to take a look at strengthening your defenses, compliance defenses for the future. And then working out those strategies, companies need to assess what's changed, but more importantly, what has not changed. That political consideration certainly will influence the pace and direction of anti-corruption investigations, and you need to be as ready as you can for this. Certainly, Malaysia is a very important trading partner of the United States, and when you couple the regime change, the democratic regime change, I would add, that has occurred in Malaysia with that of South Africa and how that's going to lead directly to more robust, at least investigation of corruption and bribery. I think if you're doing business in those countries, you need to not only scrub your operations, but as these authors suggest, strengthen your defenses going into the future. Next up, I wanted to give a shout out to my good friend Eric Moorhead. Eric has been in the compliance field really about as long as most anyone. I would say since at least kind of 04-05 time frame. And Eric has his own consulting company now, Moorhead Consulting. But he has a compliance podcast called Compliance Beat. And I listen to it regularly because it's a very tactically focused nuts and bolts podcast. I always get some insight from it. But here's the insight I got from listening to a recent episode. Eric takes messages by carrier pigeon. And frankly, I'm not aware of any other compliance practitioner, including myself, who accepts messages via carrier pigeon. So with that unique message format, shout out to Eric Moorhead, shout out to Compliance Beat. If you haven't checked it out, please do so. It's a great podcast. It's available on iTunes and also on Eric's site, Moorhead Consulting. I'm extraordinarily pleased to announce I have a hopefully what you will think is a interesting week-long podcast series coming up next week on my podcast, Innovation in Compliance. It's something I've wanted to do for some time, and I finally sat down earlier this month and took the time to do it, which is a 5-part podcast series on the intersection of Sherlock Holmes and innovation in compliance. So each day in each podcast, I take one Sherlock Holmes story and tie that to a innovation in compliance. So on day one, I take Study in Scarlet, and we look at digital strategies for the compliance practitioner. On day two, we review the blue carbuncle and how that informs the digital twin, a concept for manufacturing, and how you can use that in compliance. In day three, we take a look at the speckled band and how the role of a CCO has in many ways morphed into a data translator. In episode 4, one of my favorite stories, The Adventures of Silver Blaze and the interpretation of data by the compliance function. And finally, on day 5, Copper Beaches and the digital future of compliance. All of these podcasts will be released on Monday, August 6th on iTunes. So if you like to binge listen, this will certainly be the one for you. And I will release them each day on my site, the one you're listening to if you're on my site, the FCPA Compliance Report, or on JD Supra. So I hope you will check out this series. I've certainly enjoyed putting it together, and I hope you will find it useful and enjoyable going forward. So this really brings me to the top story I want to talk about today, and that is the Houston Astros. And I recently wrote several pieces throwing out kudos to the Astros for their 2017 World Series win, how they literally went from worst to first to become champions of Major League Baseball for the first time ever. But they, I think, made a serious misstep this week, and that misstep was around the trade for a relief pitcher, Robert Oseuna. Robert Oseuna currently is on the Toronto Blue Jays. He doesn't play for them because he's suspended. He's suspended because he is alleged to have been involved in domestic abuse. He is under criminal indictment for this in the province of Ontario. Major League Baseball slapped a 75-game suspension on him. That suspension ends this weekend. The Astros traded a reliever, Kenny Giles, who you may remember had absolute collapse in last year's World Series to the point where they couldn't use him anymore. They traded he and a couple of prospects for Osuna. So the issue is, number one, should the Astros have traded for someone who's at least to have alleged to have been a part of or engaged in domestic abuse? The perhaps more troubling part about this is that the Astros have a announced zero-tolerance policy for domestic abusers. And so the question becomes, what does zero tolerance mean? Well, according to the Astros, zero tolerance means zero tolerance for people who are playing for and or contracted to the Astros. It does not mean zero tolerance for people on other teams, apparently, particularly if you have a cannon right arm and can get people out in the ninth inning. So zero tolerance to the Astros means if you engaged in or alleged to engage in domestic abuse on another team, that doesn't apply. This is a pretty, what's the right word, amorphous, flexible, in some ways, not very good interpretation from my perspective. Nevertheless, it brings up another point that is not often discussed, which is what is the role of a disciplinary measure? Is it to punish? Is it deter? Is it to rehabilitate? Because if someone engages in conduct that's so reprehensible that they're literally banned for life from engaging in their craft, even if their craft happens to be the pitching in the ninth inning of a World Series game, should that really be it? And in an article that I've cited to in my show notes, David Barron, writing in the Houston Chronicle, quoted Cindy Southworth, an executive vice president of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, for the following. How do you balance redemption and behavioral change with holding people accountable? It's messy. It's not straightforward. You can do both. So the Astros, in a statement, said that not only did this conduct occur not when he was with the Astros, but that Osuna would benefit from great examples of character in the existing clubhouse, which will help him with a fresh start. So in the FCPA world, or the greater anti-corruption world, if someone engages in bribery and corruption and you want to hire them and you find out about that in a background due diligence, you are noticed that they at least have propensity to do this. And does that propensity, will it occur, reemerge? Will they be a recidivist in the future? It's unclear, obviously, about Mr. Oseuna. He's only 23. So perhaps there should be a chance for redemption. Certainly in the FCPA world, we've seen people who are in the greater fraud world, people who have engaged in fraud or corruption, bribery and corruption, gone to jail, come out, and now are contributing members to the compliance community. The other issue is whether or not this is going to hurt the Astros clubhouse. Then the reason I bring this up is the addition of Oseuna could cause friction amongst the players. Two very, very high-profile pitchers for the Astros, Justin Verlander and Lance McCullers, have made public statements about players who commit domestic violence. This was in the context of a prior Astro minor leaguer who was charged and released. Justin Verlander specifically noted that he said some pretty inflammatory things, but basically he's going to see what happens. I don't know if that means he has an open mind, he's open to talking to this person, or there's a certain moral flexibility that he's engaging in as well, because Oseuna has this cannon right arm. All of this is very troubling within the baseball community, within the Houston baseball community. I would say the Astros have lost the public relations battle. Barron's piece quoted one fan, Jim Greenwell, "Why would the Astros commit such a mistake is incomprehensible." Buster Olney, the ESPN national baseball correspondent, said it was surprising, disappointing, shocking, and appalling. Perhaps the best line came from Jeff Passan, a writer at Yahoo Sports, who said that the Astros have emulated other teams that display moral bankruptcy by acquiring a player of tainted character, because at the end of the day, he can get outs in the ninth inning. So it's very troubling, but it brings up some important questions that I don't think we really talk enough about in the compliance community, which is what's the purpose of discipline? Is it simply punishment? Is it deterrence? Is it rehabilitation? Is it all three? Is it some combination? If you hire someone who's engaged in bribery and corruption and you put controls in place to try to detect or prevent it from going forward, and they do so, what do you think the Department of Justice or Securities and Exchange Commission will say about that? So very troubling for the Astros, very troubling for Astros fans, and perhaps for the greater compliance community, raises some questions that I think need to be explored going forward. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Next week, Jay Rosen will be back, and he and I will both explore the week's stories on This Week in FCPA. Hello again, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I hope you'll join us again next week when Jay Rosen returns and we're back to our regular format. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.